Ciao Verona, um, sono Matheus e sono molto felice di essere qui con te. And that's how the Italian I got for now. But yeah, let's discuss this journey of React so far. I'm so hyped for this moment. And before we start, I do have a little bit of a disclaimer. So it's actually more than 10 years, 11 now. And we have like 40 minutes here, so it's just a lot to talk about. And it's no wonder that other people, for example, they created a React documentary that goes more than an hour, or other folks like Ryan Carniato, they have even a full 5 hour stream talking about the story of React. So we don't have 5 hours, but let's try to fit in some content in here. And that's kind of how it's gonna be for the next couple minutes. I'm gonna be trying to organize and see how piece together like the past, what's coming to the future, some lessons I think we've learned as a community so far, and also the trouble in paradise moments because not everything was perfect all along. No further ado, let's go all the way back to the past. And for this, I really want to have your help. So I would very kindly ask you to scan this QR code and let me know what you were doing before React. It can be maybe the first wave of things like jQuery, or you were doing PHP, Ruby on Rails, or maybe other SPA frameworks like Angular, Vue, etc. And it's crazy because for a second looks not so much, but when you have to make some small talk in the meantime, it sounds a lot. But yeah, I still see some phones. So let's give it a yeah. Two. Okay, cool. Now this is the part where I really hope this is gonna work. And we're gonna see some responses. Amazing. So mostly jQuery, Angular, PHP, .NET, Angular JS, uh, probably WordPress, cool. iOS. Yeah, I did some iOS too, by the way, and jQuery, and I see Objective, so that's probably Objective C from iOS. Cool. Yeah, cool. Hadden. I don't know what Tabakayo is, but I'm gonna assume it's something cool. This is a really good snapshot because that's kind of what the web was like for different generations. We had some precursors like templating engines like Handlebars or Jade that became Pug and etc. We had backend technologies like Rails and all the ones we had in the PHP ecosystem. Then we had this first wave of SPAs with things like Angular, Ember, Backbone, Knockout. And then we had another generation with React, Angular, Vue, Svelte, and some things in between these different waves like Almond. We're approaching a whole other wave of amazing stuff like Quick, Solid, and etc. Also, at that time, we had some variants of these technologies, things like Strace, Batman, CanJS, or Knockback that was a mix of Knockout and Backbone. And not only these were the technologies, but that's what a snapshot of the web was like. So positions would be around these things. The open source projects were around these technologies. Blog posts revolved around that. So yeah, that said, this is where a huge chunk of Facebook was, or now Meta was, before React. They had this thing called Boat that you can still find in the web archive. And Boat was this client-side MVC framework that basically combined a bunch of existing tools at the time to handle complex interactivity in different parts of Facebook, like the feed, timeline, perhaps the chat, and others. And Boat.js actually introduced some of the things we that eventually made their way into React, which includes the render method, the create class that we're not using that anymore, and the whole idea of refs. As the applications within Facebook grew more and more complex, they started experimenting with other stuff. And then this guy called Jordan Walk, he created Facts.js. And Jordan Walters, who we know nowadays as the father of React, and he created Facts.js to address complexity that was escalating. And Facts.js solved the same problems both did, but in a very, very different way. So it wasn't MVC based to begin with, and it tried to have a whole lot of different approach that was more functional. And it also introduced the concept of re-rendering when something in the state, re-rendering the UI when something in the state changes. And that's also when we got some fundamentals of React we know nowadays, like props, state, and organizing things in terms of components. Another thing that was happening at the time too was this thing called XHB. And XHB was part of the hack language and the hack virtual machine created by Facebook. And this existed since 2010. And it was an extension of PHP. And it was initially created to address problems with XSS and other security issues. But it ended up being a very, very interesting way to structure applications with some custom components, because XHP would do exactly this. So you could have this kind of XML that would be transpiled into something like this, which I'm pretty sure sounds somewhat familiar to you and to what we understand nowadays as JSX. So you bake all of these together, and I guess you know that the rest is history. And we in 2013 we had that epic talk by Pete Hunt that he had a bunch of codes that went viral at the time, and one of them was, with React you can build applications without even thinking about performance, and the default state is fast. This was 2013. And then suddenly the web was flooded with a bunch of posts praising React. And this one is called Pure UI by Guillermo Rauch, who is the CEO of Vercel, or Zeit at the time. And he says, with this model in place, the programmer is thus relieved from the burden of specifying transition between states or transformation of the UI over time. And what we noticed after that was this thing that Dominic calls the React growth loop. So basically, companies started doing React because that's where a lot of developers were, because it was cool, it was trending, and new devs started doing React because basically that's where the job market was, and this just cycled back and back. But we know that it wasn't always magic. It wasn't always perfect. And actually, there was a whole lot of pushback. These are some screenshots from Reddit, Harker News, Twitter, etc. And yeah, PHP for the browser, yikes, and etc. So that's when we get to talk a little bit about moments where we had trouble in paradise in the history of React. And I got a couple of problems I wanted to discuss with you. And the first one I'm quoting, "You're missing the point of." And this is coming from a post by Dan Abramov from 2015 that's called "You're Missing the Point of React." And I think it's really, really interesting because he starts the post with, "I've seen React misunderstood by smart people more often than any other JavaScript library. React's packed with ideas that were radical at the time of introduction, and this created an air of controversy that still hasn't quite dissolved." And throughout my history doing React, I was able to validate this multiple times. One example is during 22 and 23, I was running this talk about concurrent React, some use cases, how it works under the hood, and I ran the same pulse as I ran today. And it's crazy because in the talk about concurrent React, most of the crawl across different conferences, across different meetups, and etc. But it was mostly about parallelism and multi-threading, when concurrent React is about concurrency and this kind of thing. But continuing, so Dan's post goes like, "After a year of using React and observing people learning it, I can say that the best parts of React are not the ones that made it famous. They're not virtual DOM, custom event system, server rendering, or JSX. They are rather they are a few boring, old, and powerful ideas that you now should be wondering what are they. But we'll revisit that later. Another problem I've noticed throughout many different cycles is basically ecosystem friction caused by when you or some mind-blowing things are released. So you probably remember back in 2016 when streaming SSR was out for React 16. And I'm not talking about streaming SSR with concurrent rendering from React ATM. This is 2016. And a bunch of CSS and JS libraries, they just stopped working because of the how this worked under the hood. So the community maintaining those libraries like style components and motion and etc. They had to catch up to fix so that it would work with the new thing. Same thing during the whole concurrent React narrative that went for about 4, 5, 6 years. So many state management library maintainers, they had to adapt to prevent things like UI tearing and other negative side effects caused by the changes of how React worked under the hood. And then they had to start using things like using external store and whatnot to make sure the libraries still work as they were working. And then with server components in 22, 23, after we had the app router and people started experimenting with it. And again, not only styling libraries, but for example, data layers and networking libraries, state managers like Apollo or Emotion and Style, they had to catch up with. So whenever we had this new mind-blowing thing, there's this maintenance burden. This one is a bit of a spice topic, but and I'm quoting this from this great post by Ken C. Dodds. It's called, but the post itself is a lot about Next, but he has this part where he goes like Next is eating React, and when I read that last year, I connected a lot with some other sentiment I was noticing on social media that for a lot of people, and I'm not even talking about us library app builders, but a lot of library maintainers and people building actually big projects for them, they had this impression that the lines between Next and React were getting more and more blurred. And the reason why I mentioned that is that this builds up to a whole sentiment of complexity and this feeling that React is getting more and more complex. And the reason why I say this is because that leads to the next one, that is an overall growing resentment, which is not new. Actually, when React first came out with the whole JSX thing and etc., lots of folks had pushback on it. I myself took me months to get the grasp on, okay, I like this meta model, I want to be doing this. And people even said that we were ruining JavaScript with this. And it got to a point that even Vue.js, when they came out with SFCs, they had to create a whole new section in their documentation saying that separation of concerns doesn't necessarily mean separation of file types. And this is old. It was the same thing with reactivity when folks figured out that how virtual DOM works, how the double tree model of React works, and we as a community discovered that React is not really reactive. And then this got intensified with hooks that initially had a really, really good momentum, but then we started overusing them and misusing them, and we started having whole new sessions on why we're using use effect in the wrong way, and that we should stop using use effect and etc. And we got to the point where one could argue that we needed a full hour post by Dan Abramov so we could understand how hooks work. And when we finally did, we got new hooks. So we had use layout effect and use insertion effect and whatnot. But it didn't stop there. We had also concurrent, this whole thing with concurrent React. And because it took years and years to come. And as we were getting new features under the concurrency umbrella, it wasn't clear for all of us how them all piece together, how transitions, what was the long-term plan, and etc. And now we're seeing, or we have been seeing more and more this with server components and the whole memes around the complexity and this kind of thing. But the whole point is this growing resentment that is reflected about over these posts over time. And there is one called by Jared Palmer that I really like. It's called "React is Becoming a Black Box," and it was posted exactly 5 years ago. And one of the points he raises in the topic is he does a whole simulation of a discussion between someone who's a React expert and a member of the core team. And he raises that the discussions are eventually fixed by, don't worry, it will make sense. You just need to completely reconfigure your brain. And then this all leads to, this is a post by Cassidy this year, that this feeling that React has gotten really hard to understand. And at this point, I'd like to propose you one of the first takeaways for this whole session is, as you probably know, and as you probably heard this before, software is always going through cycles. Couple of examples. This is a tweet by Andrew Clark from 2018. Andrew Clark is one of the core team members of React, and he's one of the main folks behind concurrent React. And he was showing how the whole tree comparison model that React implies under the hood, it's really inspired by a technique called double buffering. And this technique has been in the game industry for ages now. Another example is Dan Abramov in 21. He raised that all the cool stuff that many frameworks started doing in 2020, Marco by eBay was doing them in 2014. And he even references one post by the Marco engineering team from 2014. And it's crazy because if you read this post, you see that they're referencing something from 2005. And one of the hottest stuff this year by Vercel is the partial pre-rendering thing, or PPR. One of the first things they do is they link to, yeah, this actually sounds like a concept we had in the 90s. Yeah, server-side includes. So yeah, software is always going through cycles. And the same thing for trouble in paradise moments. Like we had this with JSX, we had this with hooks, with concurrent React, and with server components. What's important is that we, and mostly the folks building React, myself not included, are able to look at this. And this is a quote by one of the React engineering team blog, where they said, one lesson we've learned is that it's frustrating to the community to wait for new features without having insight into these paths that we're exploring. And another thing they mention is some of these paths were successful and many more were dead ends that led to new insights. And I think that these insights are something important for us as a community, not only of React, but of JavaScript and front end and more. Case in point, Lee Robson from Vercel, I like this because he's basically showing how competition amongst dev tools leads to overall evolution of the ecosystem. And then he gives a bunch of examples that are not related to React at all. But when I read this, I remembered a lot about this tweet by Guillermo from Vercel. This was back in 2016. And he said that React is such a good idea that we will spend the rest of the day continuing to explore its implications and applications. And now it's almost a decade over, and we're here doing exactly this. And I think that a good way to think about this is reflecting how React has pushed us all to the future. And by this, I mean other frameworks with concepts like JSX, because nowadays it's not only React doing JSX. We've had Solid, we've had Quick, we had Vue SFCs, and etc. The whole idea of Virtual DOM that also inspired a whole generation of micro frameworks, and now is even being revisited with things like Medallia.js, and people are still iterating and improving it. And also, other developer tools like hot module replacement and fast refresh. It also has inspired our platform. So there's this thing called the native scheduler API, which is an umbrella of APIs being developed. I recommend you check it out on MDN, and it's heavily inspired by the work done in the React team. And actually, some of the primitives like isInput pending are actually work of meta engineering team in coordination with with the Web Consortium, Google, and others. And back to that post by Kent, there is one quote that he is here talking about frameworks, but I do connect this with something else. So he says, I prefer to focus on a framework that can not only give me what I need from the UX perspective, but it can also give me the skills that I can use wherever I develop for the web. And probably the only person who said was doing iOS before will resonate this with me, but it's clear how other platforms were also inspired by React. And I'm talking Flutter, but not only Flutter. In Android, we have Jetpack, Compose, and Litho by a whole other different engineering team at Meta. There is Swift UI, there is Component Kit, there is Yoga Layout, and a whole other bunch of state and flow management libraries that came out in the times of Objective-C and Swift that were inspired by Flux or Redux or reactjs or whatever was the cool thing we were doing at the time. And you don't have to take my word for that. Actually, Flutter explicitly says how they're inspired by React, and this one is about Facebook's main framework for building native iOS UIs, Component Kit, heavily React inspired. So I think it's really important that we keep this kind of thing in mind when looking at possible mistakes or possible misdirections in React, because we should not forget that before cars, we didn't have car accidents. So when you innovate, of course, some things will come out of it, and all of them are going to be good. Case in point, jQuery. If you ask folks, a lot of us will say it's no longer cool to be doing jQuery or Zapto or whatever. But it turns out that jQuery's APIs and the way how it was kind of bringing the web together in a moment where it didn't have inspired a lot of the native HTML5 APIs we have nowadays. Another thing, who has done CoffeeScript before? Wow. So yeah, not a lot of people know CoffeeScript, and not a lot of people even like CoffeeScript these days. But CoffeeScript actually inspired the arrow syntax we got in ES6. So it's something inspired by a compiled to JS language that made its way to the spec. And this is one of my favorite. Who here has done Ember? Yeah, 5. Yeah. So who here has used React Router? Wow. So the most popular router in the React community actually is heavily inspired by what the Ember router was doing a decade ago. And even you're gonna even see Michael Jackson and Ryan Florence, the authors, talking about it. So it's just mad science to see how these things inspire other ecosystems and other realities. Anyways, we're in 24 now, and there's so much going on and so much about to go on. So I feel like we need to take a trip back to the future right now. And this is the last one, but every year the React team, they release this kind of blog post saying basically what they're working on, their insights on what they're working on, and etc. And I really recommend you to check out because it's super interesting to see how what happened in 21, 22, 23, etc. And also, it's super interesting to keep an eye on open PRs and RFCs and stuff like that because there's just, for example, this is FastJSX, which is an impressive performance optimization that happened back in April this year. But there's more. For first, React Server Components. and I didn't mean to go into the whole server components narrative right now, but I I'm pretty sure some of you will can relate to that. The fact that especially in 22 and 23, we really had this momentum where we're thinking like, I still need to catch up on this. I still need to get the mental model of what's going on here and why this is so innovative. I think we as a community are now getting there. We're getting more tooling. For example, in last week, they just announced React DevTools now supports server components, and we're getting also non-official developer tooling. This is called DevTools for RC by Alvar, and it basically allows you to inspect the payload of server components. So it's super interesting to, to understand that. I think we're getting more and more happy cases of people who started using server components and also good examples on what server components should be used for. This is a project called Bright by CodeHike, and it basically allows you to embed a fully featured syntax highlighting using server components in a way that it doesn't really impact your model size, which is something that otherwise would do for syntax highlighting. We're getting more and more also not so happy use cases. This one is by Brandon from Flight Control, and it's a whole migration story of how they went through what they had to the app router and server components. And we're getting also parallel implementations of the thing like Waku. So Waku is a very, very interesting micro framework in React by Daishi Kato, which is the author of half of the state management libraries we have out there for React. And he basically started drafting his own implementation of server components and documenting all of that. So it's very, very interesting to explore. And it's also very interesting to explore what other communities are doing out of server components, like server components in Go and OCaml. Of course, not production-ready projects. But anyways, we're going to have a very, very interesting talk about server components, so I invite you all to watch that. Because we also have the React, not anymore Forget, we have the React compiler now. And who here has heard of the React Forget project or compiler? Cool, yeah, some hands. So this was first introduced at ReactConf 21. And as we speak, a couple of days ago, it just hit its beta release, which is great. So we're gonna have a talk about it. I'm not gonna go into details, but the React compiler is something set out to improve the rendering performance by automatically generating calls to use Mimo, use callback, and Mimo, and etc. calls. And it aims to minimize the cost of re-rendering. And so think of it as an automatic optimization compiler that focuses really heavily on memoization. And as this evolves, we're getting more and more in-depth exploration. So this is a collection of posts by Satya, one of the main guys at Meta working in the compiler. And he goes in-depth into the whole programming languages and compiler theory behind the React compiler. And it's just great to see so many content we usually would see in computer science classes, but apply to something that's going to benefit our daily life. We're getting more and more tooling. So this is the compiler playground, and it's available right now. So you can write your components, and you can see how they're going to be mapped, not only the final output, but phase by phase, what the compiler is going to be doing to them. We're getting more and more tooling. So now we have the ES plugin for the compiler, and we have this React compiler runtime that allows you to use the React compiler if you don't have React 19. So React 17 and 18. And we're just getting our first case studies with things like, so this one is an example of Specify, which is a huge and popular open source project. And they just started using it as a separate branch, the compiler, and came up with some metrics around it. We also gonna have a very interesting talk about the compiler, so stick around. And there are less popular things like what was once called off-screen and now has been renamed to activity. So off-screen is going to allow you to render things in the background with no additional overhead. And basically it means that your components, they want won't mount until they're visible, and the effects are not fired either. So this allows you to toggle visibility of things without losing state, which has actually a bunch of interesting use cases because you can integrate this into routers and other UI libraries. So for example, a router can use that to pre-render screens in the background so that they're instantly available. Or if you're writing a tab switching component, you can do that without losing the state. Or if even you're doing some virtualization, you probably use virtualization libraries. So these libraries under the hood, they can use this to pre-render additional rows, to pre-render things without the additional rows that they usually have. And if you check the source of the React reconciler, you're gonna see everywhere that off-screen inactivity are already in the works. In the last update, they said that it's still under active research and they remain work to finalize the primitives that are exposed to library developers. So they've deprioritized this area while they focus on shipping things that are more complete, but this is something you can expect to happen eventually in the next couple of years. Another thing I'm really looking forward is what's called suspense for CPU bound trees. So this one is not new. Actually, the first PR by Andrew Clark traces back to 2020. Yeah, so 4 years ago exactly. And Dan Abramov has this code sandbox where you can see that they're planning on adding this. They've actually added this prop that's called unstable expected load time. Right now it behaves as a boolean, but they will eventually come up with some clever heuristics for this number. And it's basically what this will do with React is it's gonna force a fallback on the initial render, regardless of whether something is actually suspensed or not. So during the initial mount, you can skip over the expensive parts of your tree. So that's why they call it for CPU bounds. And there are a lot of things that for a lot of time were called the future and are now getting to be the present. Things like optimistic state updates that otherwise we would need third-party libraries and etc. Now we have use optimistic within React Canary. APIs for resource preloading are now exposed under resource hints for Next.js, but they're part of React Done too. And things like transition tracing that is built on top of the interaction time API are also in the works. So you can basically come up with very, very meaningful metadata to track your transitions fired across your components. Not only this, but React Native too. So I can go on without talking about React Native. The first thing is literally this week, the new React Native architecture is now made the default, and that's basically the result of 5-6 years of work by the React Native team. Not only this, but things like static Hermes. Who here does React Native? Who here has heard of static Hermes? Cool. So static Hermes is this thing that modifies the JavaScript semantics to allow efficient sound typing. And the core thing you get is you can bridge the predictability of C in terms of performance with the usability of just coding JavaScript or TypeScript or whatever via ahead of time compilation. And the final goal is you can mix and match bytecode and native code based on what you need. I really recommend you watch this talk by Tsvetan Mikov. He's part of the core team building this at Meta. It's really interesting, and the benchmarks are just great when you see Hermes that is used nowadays versus this static Hermes. And there's also React Strict Done. So if you've ever used React Native for web, that's an opposite approach by the same guy who built it, Nicholas Gallagher, and a whole team. There are basically small polyfills that are responsible to translate the APIs to React Native and React Native Web, but having less overhead on the web side of it. And it's also powered by StyleX, which is this CSS in JS, utility CSS in JS library by Meta that was recently announced. So this is the RFC where they announced the React Native for Web thing, the React Strict Dump thing. But basically, I recommend if you're interested, this is the basically, and definitely it would take a whole slot to talk about, but this is the architecture of React Native for web. So before React Strict done, and this is all the overhead that goes to the browser. So React Strict done is going to do the opposite and move this overhead to native, where it can be better handled than the browser. And there are so many other things. So for example, React Native for Vision OS, that is like, it's basically a proof of concept that is open source, but you can start playing with it. And we have more and more games, AR, VR, and even spatial computing based stuff for React Native. And this is super powerful. All of these are projects by Deployment's open source initiative. So wrapping up, a couple of lessons learned. I would say that besides the two we've already talked about, I think that it's clear at this point how React throughout the years has been acting as this democratic agent of knowledge, of computer science knowledge, to us mere front-end developers. Because of React, we're discussing domain-specific languages, compiler theory, concurrency, fibers, effect handlers, immutability, and whatnot. And it's really great. Another thing is that it sounds like trivial, but we sometimes tend to forget that something that it doesn't imply something else. So, for example, scheduling and all these interesting scheduling primitives, they don't necessarily mean better performance. They might have their overheads. Server components, they don't necessarily mean a better authoring experience, or they don't even necessarily mean better performance. They have overhead too. So the cliche that there's no silver bullet is true, and it's important that we, on a daily basis, when making architecture decisions, not only around React, but around anything, we identify what are core metrics for us. Just like RSCs or use effect or whatever, JSX created a similar feeling among the whole developer community. It was going against so many best practices that this could never be a good thing. And yet, here we are with it. And by the way, this applies to other stuff like Tailwind. This exact same syntax you could replace with Tailwind. And overall, I think that React is still good enough for most of us because nothing is inherently wrong about it. And this is my vision, but I think it's gonna take something that's a lot better than it to replace it. And I think we're not there yet. And you're gonna see this about specific things like virtual DOM and how virtual DOM is fast enough for most people. You're gonna see this around React server-side rendering capabilities. And there's this code by Adam Rakis that I don't know if I agree with the magic number he says here, but I think there is a threshold that React optimizes up to. It might be 90%, 99, 95%, and then you can go to solid, quick, or Preact, whatever. But the point is, for a huge majority of apps, React still optimizes for them. And then Laurie Voss, the founder of NPM, he says, in my experience, frameworks never get replaced by something incrementally better. They get replaced by a totally different way of doing things. And then he continues, I have yet to see a thing that looks fundamentally different from React growing in popularity. I'm seeing growing popularity. And I connect this to another quote from the post by Sherman from 2015, where he says, in general, comparing libraries or frameworks in terms of features seems inferior to comparing the mental model it imposes on the programmer. The latter will inform you about how well the code will fare over time as the product matures and the team grows, but the former won't. It will also empower you to foresee what evolutionary path of technology looks like. And then, remember we talked about Dan's post from almost a decade ago. So he says, now that we're not surprised by virtual DOM anymore, and it's being adopted by other frameworks and libraries, we can focus on examining React's true strengths. Composition, omnidirectional data flow. I would say that freedom from DSLs didn't age quite well, but explicit mutation and static mental model. So I think that's what we should be doing. do we still have these nowadays? That I think that's the thing we should question. Because overall reports of a certain tools that are really exaggerated. People claim that Virtual Dawn was that, and now we have Medallia.js. People claimed for a while that Ruby Rails was that, and they continue to evolve. People claim that PHP was that, and it's still growing. So, and all of the things that claim that React is dying, they all of the posts, they end something like, yeah, you know what, I can't really quit this ecosystem. And I think that one thing that shows this really well is not only the state of JS charts, but also other charts like this one by Netlify, where they say that you can see here on the y-axis that, yeah, people are getting, some people are getting less happy with it, but is it declining? Not as far as you can tell. Actually, it's growing in usage, as you can see on the x-axis. But yeah, and this is from a post about PHP. Like I've seen the axiom, I hear the axiom that PHP is dying since 10 years. And I feel we're getting at this point with React. But at the same time, yes, it can die for you, and that's okay. Last one. Don't always trust those speculations and feature predictions, because again, most of the things are exaggerated. And case in point, myself. So this picture is terrible, but this is me about a decade ago. And I was at this native iOS meetup, and I was telling them about Angular and Ionic, and how Ionic was the future of native development. So I said, yeah, drop Objective-C and Swift because that's the future. Needless to say that native iOS is still here, native Android is still here. This is me now. I am Matheus Albuquerque. You can find me everywhere as Y Combinator. I am a staff software engineer at Medallia, and I'm a Google developer expert in performance. Do check out the feedback form by the conference. Do provide feedback. Thank you so much. Grazie mille.
Thank you, Matheus, for this.
I'm not sure if we still have time for questions, but
maybe one.
Maybe, yeah.
One question. Someone. Yeah.
I can put the QR code in the meantime.
I can do one. I have a lot of questions for you, but no question. No. Okay.
Yeah. Feel free to. Yeah, find me
I
at
can
the
make
conference.
I can make you a question, a quick question, because there was the next conf yesterday.
Yeah.
So, do you think Next.js? Sorry, please, guys. We're still talking. Do you think the Next.js is going to address the React in the future, or not?
Address as encompass it, or?
Yeah, to bring React in some direction as a framework.
I think they're already somewhat doing this, not only with server components, but with some internal decisions. Because, I mean, it's kind of inevitable. Like, they have very, very crucial people from React at this point at Vercel. Sebastian Mark Bosch, the father of React, of Fibers and the whole Fiber infrastructure, he is there. And Andrew Clark, one of the main guys behind Concurrent React. So they have decision makers there. And I think that this will impact somewhat, but I don't think, my guess is definitely not 100% because of parallel efforts like Remix and stuff like this. So yeah, I don't think they will 100% encompass. I think that they were already driving some decisions to a sense. There's even one really good post by Vercel from 2013 that's not about React. It's called Framework Driven Infrastructure. And I think that Vercel, as an infrastructure company, they will be trying to drive some things in Next, and they will make the internals of React work for the things they want to do in Next, for the things they want to do in infrastructure. We'll notice this more and more, but not 100%, no. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Make some noise for Matheus.